learners, and welcome to the session on displacement and migration of tribals. This is offered by the School of Social Work, and this is taken from the program Certificate in Tribal Studies, and the course code is BSW044. So without any further ado, let us start with the program and understand what the session holds about. So today we are talking about displacement and migration of tribals. Now, when you talk about tribals, first of all, before getting into the intricacies of the migration and displacement, it is pertinent that we understand who are the tribals. Now, for your clarification, let me add here that tribal people have their own cultures, language, customs, and institutions which distinguish them from other parts of the society in which they find themselves. Now, indigenous and tribal, the words are used simultaneously most often than not, and they are often also known by national terms such as native people, aboriginal people, First Nation, Adivasi, Janjati, hunter-gatherers, or hill tribes. So we know that tribals are known by various names and their various connotation. However, the intrinsic factor is that they have their own culture, language, customs, and institution, which sets them apart from other societies. Now, as mentioned that they have been called by various names, it is also important to know that there is no universal definition of indigenous and tribal peoples, but the ILO Convention number 169 takes a practical approach to the issues and provide objective and subjective criteria for identifying the people concerned. Now, what are these criteria? That is important. Now, let us understand what are these criteria. The criteria can be summarized as follows. Now, we have two types of criteria, that is the subjective criteria and the objective criteria. Number one, in terms of indigenous, the subject criteria is self-identification as belonging to an indigenous people. And for the tribal people, the subjective criteria is self-identification as belonging to a tribal people. So this is the two subjective criteria for indigenous people and the tribal people. And when you look at the objective criteria, for indigenous people, we have the concept, the criteria as in descent from populations who inhabited the country or geographical region at the time of conquest, colonization, or establishment of present state boundaries. They also retain some or all of their own social, economic, cultural, and political institutions, irrespective of their legal status. Now, in terms of the tribal people, what are the objective criteria? Now, the criteria is their social, cultural, and economic conditions distinguish them from other sections of the national community. Their status is regulated wholly or partially by their own customs or tradition or by special laws or regulation. This means that tribal people, when you talk about, they are regulated by different kind of, they're regulated by their own customs and traditions, and they do not follow a certain set rule of pattern in terms of the in terms of making decisions. The decisions are made by the heads of the community at large, and all the decisions are taken together. Now, given the diversity of people, it aims at protecting. The convention uses the inclusive terminology of indigenous and tribal people. So we know that after understanding the subjective as well as the objective criteria, the ILO aims at protecting the indigenous or the tribal people. So they have used the inclusive terminology of indigenous and tribal people and ascribes the same set of rights to both the groups. Now, for example, in Latin America, the term tribal has been applied to certain Afro-descendant communities, and likewise in India, tribals are used for certain set of population or communities that are in different parts of India and who have the distinct culture, tradition, and lifestyle. Now, talking about India, let us understand the tribals in India. So, tribal people in India constitute 8.6% of the total population, which is about 104 million people according to the 2011 census, and it was previously 68 million people according to the 1991 census. So we see that the number of the population of the tribal people in India is gradually growing, which is a good sign. Now, this is the largest population of the tribal people in the world. So, India has the largest population of tribal people, and one concentration lives in a belt along the Himalayas, stretching from Jammu and Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, and Uttar Pradesh in the west to Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura, Arunachal Pradesh, Mizoram, Manipur, and Nagaland in the northeast. So we have this set of tribal people who are in India. Now, the extent to which a state's population is tribal varies considerably. In the northeastern states of India, such as Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Mizoram, and Nagaland, upward of 90% of the population is tribal. So we have the major chunk of the tribal population in these areas that I have just mentioned, which are Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Mizoram, and Nagaland. However, in the remaining northeast states of Assam, Manipur, Sikkim, and Tripura, tribal people form between 20 and 30% of the population, and the rest of the population is made up by the mainland people. Now, it is important to also understand that the largest tribes are found in central India. Although the tribal population there accounts for only around 10% of the region's total population. Major concentrations of tribal people live in Maharashtra, Orissa, and West Bengal. In the south, about 1% of the populations of Kerala and Tamil Nadu are tribal, whereas about 6% in Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka are members of different tribes. So here, as we mentioned before, it is important to understand that tribal population in India is all across India. So unlike other countries or other countries in the world, India is one country which has the largest concentration of tribal population in its own country. So it is pertinent to here understand that in the north, south, east, west we have, and in the northeast we have a great concentration of tribal people, and in central India is the maximum population who are known as the tribals. Now, looking at the other slide, another concentration lives in the hilly areas of central India, such as Madhya Pradesh, Orissa, and to a larger or lesser extent, Andhra Pradesh. In this belt, which is bounded by the Narmada River to the north and the Godavari River to the southeast, tribal people occupy the slopes of the region's mountains. Other tribals, for example, the Santals, live in Bihar and West Bengal. There are also smaller numbers of tribal people in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala in western India, in Gujarat and Rajasthan, and in the Union territories of Lakshadweep and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So practically we see, and as mentioned before, we see that a large number of tribal populations are all over India. Now, many tribals have gone out of their way to avoid contact with outsiders. This is because, as mentioned, they have a different culture, they have different traditions and different way of lifestyle, which is very different from the outsiders or the mainstream society. Now, these tribals have maintained their way of life throughout the years, largely oblivious to whether the Mongols, British, Maharajas, or Indians were in power. So, irrespective of who were ruling them, the tribals had their own distinct lifestyle. Now, improved transportation and communications, however, brought even deeper intrusions into tribal lands. Merchants and a variety of government policies involved tribal peoples more thoroughly in the cash economy, although by no means on the most favorable of terms, which means that the cash economy started among the tribal regions. Now, in spite of the cash economy and in spite of the influx of transportation because of the roads that are being built, tribal population did not always have the fair share of the deal. So they were always on the marginalized level. So that is the reason why probably they chose to live from the highlights of the outside world or the outside community, as they have the distinct lifestyle and they were not much into the cash economy. However, now of late, the cash economy among the tribal people have started. Now, looking further, as mentioned, improved transportations and communication have brought about a large number of economic development among the tribals. Now, large areas also of the tribals fell into the hands of non-tribals, and in around 1900, when many regions were opened by the government to homestead style settlement. So which means that earlier the tribal areas were protected, they were confined to themselves by the government. However, during the 1900, a large part of the tribal areas were open to the outsiders or to the mainland, or for a use of a specific word, the non-tribal people. So these regions where the tribals were inhabiting, they were open to the outside people, and that is the reason why we see a lot of intermingling of the tribals and the non-tribals in the areas. Now, land, if you look at in terms of ownership at all, it was viewed as a communal resources. Now, it was free to whosoever needed it. By the time tribals accepted the necessity of obtaining formal land titles, they had lost the opportunity to lay claim to lands that might rightfully have been considered theirs. So they were, as mentioned, they did not have a good share of the deal, fair share of the deal. So a lot of the tribals ended up losing out their rights of the land. Generally, tribals were severely disadvantaged in dealing with government officials who granted land titles. Now, the colonial regime realized the necessity of protecting tribals from the predations of outsiders and prohibited the sale of tribal lands. So this was a kind of a relief to a lot of tribals who were able to have a holding of the land within their own areas. However, this would be short-lived. Now, in the 1970s, the gains tribal people had made in earlier decades were eroded in many regions, especially in central India. Migration into tribal lands increased dramatically, and the deadly combination of constabulary and revenue officers uninterested in tribal welfare and sophisticated non-tribals willing and able to bribe local officials was sufficient to deprive many tribals of their land holdings. So this is the reason why nowadays, where a lot of tribal lands that were belonging to them they have lost out on a lot of land and a land title, because the tribals were unaware of their land rights. So most of the outsiders or people who had money, the moneyed people or the people who were interested in land holdings, they were able to take a fair share of the land holdings, and that is where most of the tribals have lost out on their own lands in their own community. Now, talking about the migration aspect, large-scale migration of the tribals, let us look at the displacement and migration of tribals. So in short, before we go into this, we have heard about the tribals, who are the tribals in India, and what are the characteristics of the tribals. Now, looking into the displacement and migration of tribals, it is pertinent here to mention that displacement and migration are two major sociological phenomena. By the end of the session, you will have an understanding of displacement and its implication, primarily for the marginalized communities, the need of a comprehensive rehabilitation policy in the country, migration and its kinds, and relationship between displacement and migration. So now here, if you look at the screen, I have presented to you a small diagram depicting what is displacement and what is migration. Now, for your understanding, let me just read out. Displacement is more than physical dislocation. It is being uprooted and dismemberment of the socio-economic webs of life with traumatic experiences. Displacement results into a spiral of impoverishment. Displacement threatens the existence and identity of people. There is a process of dispossession in displacement. So we see that displacement is not only a physical dislocation, but it is more of a loss, a psychosocial trauma which a person goes through. So imagine you are staying in a particular place for more than 100 years with your ancestors and your grandparents, and now it's your turn, and suddenly you're asked to move out from that place. So it will cause a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, a lot of psychosocial trauma. So this is what displacement holds about. And secondly, let us look at what migration is. If you look at the slide that I have presented for you. Now, when you look at migration, migration is not a new phenomenon. and it is not going to end in the near future as well. Now, existing anthropological and archaeological literature indicates that the early human beings migrated from one place to another for security, sustenance, and stability. So we can see that there's a vast difference between what displacement and migration is all about. Displacement is being uprooted from the place of which you are staying. Now, for example, if the tribal people who have been staying in the hilly areas or the hill areas of the region, and they are asked to move from that place, that is displacement. They have to be depossessed of all their belongings, their cultural rights, their traditions, the ancestors, a part of what their life has been all through the years. So they are displaced from their home, literally. Now, migration, on the other hand, is a little bit more fair in terms of it is a voluntary decision in terms of looking for a better opportunity in life, or in terms of employment, marriage, or involuntary because of wars, because of looking for a better standard of living. So what happens is migration is something which is compared to displacement might be a little bit more easier on the person's mindset, because displacement is completely dispossession from one's place, and migration may be voluntary or involuntary, about which we will read about in the later session. Now, coming ahead with the terms, let us understand that it is estimated that in the last 65 years after independence of India, there are more than 60 to 70 million displaced persons in the country. Now, according to a study, it is also estimated that only about 24% of the displaced are rehabilitated, and more than 75% are left in the lurch. So, which means a very small percentage of the displaced people have been rehabilitated, and there is an interrelation between displacement and migration. Now, let us look at migration. Ever since the existence of humanity, human beings have been and are still migrating. In various periods in the history of mankind, ranging from the Vedic period through the colonial period to the contemporary times, migrations in varying degrees have been taking place. Now, in the contemporary world, the phenomenon of migration has been quite common. So we see that this is also self-explanatory when we talk about displacement and migration. Now, when you say about migration, it is in terms of the fact that a large number of human society, or a large chunk of people, migrate from one part or to the other part of the world, or even to the cities. Now, there's different kinds of migration from rural to rural, or urban to urban, or rural to urban, urban to rural. So we'll understand about this in a little while. And displacement, however, we have seen that it is causing more anxiety and dispossession. And as per the studies that we've mentioned, only 24% of displaced people have been successfully rehabilitated, which leaves around 76% of the people have not been rehabilitated, and there's a long way to go to rehabilitate them. Now, moving ahead in terms of migration and displacement, now we will understand what exactly is displacement in a little bit more detail. Now, it is important to ask what and how of displacement when one person talks about displacement. But more important is the question, why and whose, why the displacement, who are being displaced. Now, displacement is a process where poorer sections are pushed out of their own habitat. Now, it is a situation where the marginalized people have no other choice but move from their own village or place of origin to another place. So here we can see that when we talk about displacement, it is mostly for the poorer section of the people. So why are the poor section of the people displaced in most cases? Now, it could be because some corporate housing buys the entire piece of land that they are staying in and want to set up a corporate office or a grand hotel, or for building dams. Like we've seen, Narmada Bachao Andolan is one example where a large number of people were displaced from their own homes for the creation of the dam. So these are the reason why we say that mostly people who are belonging from the poorer section of the society are are lying in the way of being displaced, because they are the one who bear the brunt of the displacement. Now, going ahead also, we see that the local inhabitants lose their command over the resources, because once they are displaced, they have no command over the local resources. Now, given the number of displacements, types of displacement, and the plight suffered by the displaced, many are now asking, whose nation is it? Whose good is being served? Is it for the planners, the administrators, implementing agencies, or upper middle class or marginalized sections of the society? So this means that, as mentioned, when we talk about displacement, it is primarily for the people who are belonging to the poorer section of the society. We never see a person who's at the middle class or who have a certain standing in a society being displaced. Probably the concept of displaced for them might be different, but when you look at an entire community, entire sections of the population, we see that this displacement happens primarily with the poorer section of the society, and they are forced to move out of the comfort of their home, and they have no control over the resources that they have already built. Now, which means that, as we have seen before in the earlier slides, only 24% of the people are rehabilitated among those who have been displaced, and 76% or more still needs to be rehabilitated. So this is a vast, in terms of statistic, it is a vast number, because we have to look at the kind of rehabilitation that we provide. So now the question that arises is India's bill or India's policy equipped to rehabilitate the number of people that have been displaced? Are we looking at the displacement policies where we are able to rehabilitate a large number of people, and are we able to provide a comfortable standard of living for the people who are displaced? So these are the certain questions as students, or as a citizen, or as a people in the community, we have to ask ourselves, because probably it's not you and me who are displaced right now, but tomorrow you and I could be there who are displaced. And therefore, if we are able to question ourselves and question the government in terms of these approaches or rehabilitative measures, it is important that we know the answers, because then the displacement procedure, even if it has to happen, we are all living a comfortable life, at least without being uprooted from what the resources that we have created. So now, before going into the other details, we'll be taking a short break, and afterwards we will be taking in more details the concept of migration, and we will be doing a bit of a rewind of what we have done. So thank you, and stay tuned.
We wear clothes on a daily basis, but have we ever wondered, where do our clothes come from? Who makes our clothing? And who are the people and the process responsible for the whole manufacturing of our clothing? If you want to know more about this, Indira Gandhi National Open University from the School of Continuing Education has launched a program which is Certificate in Apparel Merchandising. There are many benefits after doing this program. You can become a designer in various fields. It can be fashion designer, apparel designer, costume designer, or even a textile designer. One can also work as a fashion consultant. Research and development is another field which one can take up after doing this certificate course. Going into academics is another perk after doing this program. Getting into fashion houses or fashion studios as an intern is also a very good option post doing the certificate in apparel merchandising. The basic eligibility of the program is 10+2. The duration of the program is 6 months to 2 years. The program is also available for both the admission cycles, which is July and January. The exams are conducted twice a year, in June and December. So what are you waiting for? Join this program and get an enriching knowledge in the field of apparel merchandising. And to do so, you can log on to the official website of the university, www.ignou.ac.in.
Welcome back after the short little break. Before we went for a break, we talked about who are the tribals, and we have emphasized the fact that tribals are a group of population of people who have their own set of distinctive culture, tradition, and religion. Now, we also talked about the displacement and migration of tribals. In terms of displacement, we have highlighted the fact that displacement leads to much more psychosocial trauma and uprootment of one belongings and places, and leads to a lot of distress. However, migration could be voluntary and involuntary, and we talked about a lot in detail. Now, moving ahead with displacement, let us also be informed that planners and administrator invariably capitalize on and manipulate the relatively weaker section or the socio-economic and political position of the displaced person. Now, their members are underestimated. So the number of the displaced people are underestimated. They are treated indifferently, and only minimal cash compensation, if at all, is paid to them. They are rarely granted security of tenure or alternative developed land. Now, apart from the immediate economic loss, displacement also brings about social, cultural, and psychological dislocation. The physical displacement of the people leads to their uprooting from their socio-cultural base, which is no less pathetic than the dispossession of land. They lose their traditional mechanism of social control, and as a result, social tensions increase among them. So this is among the displaced people. Now, the history of the tribals have been one of displacement without rehabilitation. If the history of Jharkhand is traced in the Muslim, British, and post-colonial periods, one is amazed as to how involuntary displacements have taken place down the centuries with no rehabilitation or without adequate rehabilitation. One of the excuses by various governments is that there is no policy on rehabilitation. Nevertheless, what is a matter of grave concern is the attitude of partisanship to a few haves at the cost of the have-nots. So we have the haves increasing in terms of the economic values, as well as the have-nots always suffering. Now, it is precisely this approach that is discriminatory against the weaker sections, especially the tribals. The alienation of land was one of the main reasons of the many tribal uprising all over the country, which is still ongoing, and we are still having tribal uprising. Now, in 1793, the British passed the Permanent Settlement Act to get as much revenue from land as possible. This act, common in Bengal, Awadh, and Madras presidencies, gave zamindars absolute propriety right on land. Now, there were middlemen who were created to collect revenues from their respective areas. Therefore, water, land, and forests, hitherto considered being community-owned natural resources, became private property of individual owners. Now, the new landed class was naturally happy with these new arrangements, since it enabled them to establish recorded rights over land. However, on the other hand, what happened was that there was an increasing need for land, for railway roads, other government projects, for forest produce to support British industries. Now, it was established rights over the ownership of land that the British created the Land Acquisition Act in 1894. This act facilitated the British control by destroying local people's rights over the country's natural resources. Now, the Draconian Act of 1894, that is the Land Acquisition Act, continued till as recently as 1984 when few amendments were made. One should also understand when we talk about tribals that land is sacred to the tribals because this is the only resource they have for their sustenance. About 70% of India's population, most of whom are tribals, primarily depend on land-related work and agricultural production, and that is why land is of a very important resources for these tribals, and that is why we have a lot of land uprising happening among the tribals, because as we've seen before, most of the tribals are losing their title right to the land because they were not informed or they had no prior information, and the conflict between the haves and the have-nots have always widened the gap between the tribals and the rich outsiders who are able to buy lands at a much expensive cost. And most of the tribals to whom the land belongs, they were unaware of the title deed or whatsoever. So this has been percolating down during the pre-independence, and it continued during the independence of India. Now, when you talk about land, excuse me, land for them is a mean of livelihood, as we've mentioned, as it sets the basis for socio-economic relationship. And alienation from land and displacement have threatened the livelihoods of millions. And however, the most saddening part is rehabilitation is not an integral part of the displacement plan. So when we see a lot of issues being raised in terms of the displaced population, the rehabilitation becomes an issue. It becomes a point of debate in the government sector, and this is yet to be fulfilled. Now, why is displacement and livelihood important? Now, let us look at that. Negative impacts of globalization and industrialization through the corporate are affecting the tribals and other deprived communities across the country, especially those located in major areas of the tribal region. Now, these regions are also called homeland of large number of tribal and the so-called primitive tribal groups. Now, the survival rights of these groups related to food and livelihood and customary practice reflecting the community's identity goes beyond the state administrative boundary. Now, the recent development intervention have led to major setback for the existence of these people, threatening their very survival. Now, we have to understand why displacement as a norm. Now, the fact that there is no national comprehensive rehabilitation and resettlement policy is of grave concern. The most disturbing part of the rehabilitation policy is its concept of displacement as a norm and not as an exception or the last resort. Now, the policy is meant only for the project affected families and not for the affected without the project in question. So the resettlement zone, when one talks about it, for one group of people, in fact, is the displacement zone for another again. So there's a lot of confusion in terms of this. And the land required could be for any company. It could be a corporate body, an institution, or any other organization for whom land is to be acquired, either for its own use or for public interest. And that is why it is important to understand what are the inner contradictions that happens when you talk about the displacement aspect. Now, the notion of development by dispossessing tribals of their land is contradictory in terms, because when you are talking about development, you cannot depossess a person from their habitation. So if you uproot a person from where they've been staying for ages, then there is no development happening. Now, the government is aware of the traumatic psychological and socio-cultural consequences beside deprivation and displacement of their lands, livelihood, and resource base. The stress, however, seemed to be on compulsory acquisition of land for public purpose and the inevitability of displacement. So in the garb of public purpose, the land being taken is also eroding the concept of development. Now, the policy talks of minimizing large scale displacement to the extent possible, but does not say anything about efforts to prevent displacement altogether. Now, these are some of the contradictions. Though the policy seeks to handle the issue of displacement with utmost care, the text that follows hardly reflects any desire to stop displacement. And also, the policy acknowledges that cash compensation does not really enable the victims to obtain cultivable land, homestead, and other resources which they had to surrender to the state. Now, when you talk about displacement, and we've talked about the displacement and how the tribals are affected, it is important to know the problems around the rehabilitation policy. Now, there is an absence of an adequately comprehensive rehabilitation policy in India, although a rehabilitation policy was promulgated in February 2004 and a second one on October 31st, 2007. The government of India is now working on a rehabilitation bill, but it is not sure as to when it will take the form of the law. So, a law is much more important than a bill. So, until now, only Maharashtra has a rehabilitation law for all displaced persons. Madhya Pradesh and Karnataka have laws. Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan have policies for irrigation. Orissa has a comprehensive policy. No northeastern state has a rehabilitation policy, which is surprising because when we are talking about displacement, when we are talking about migration of the tribals, this is one important aspect which one has to keep in mind, because when we talk of displacement of the tribals from their land, from their homeland, and having no rehabilitative policy for them, it is quite contradictory, because we cannot talk about development of the tribals when we are uprooting them from their own comfort of their home. So that is also another contradiction. And Jharkhand also does not have any rehabilitative policy, either, despite rampant displacement taking place all over the state. Now, when we talk at communities, we see that most of the communities have to enter into a relationship of collaboration with one another and not on domination. So it is important that all the community come together and work towards it. Now let us move on to the concept of migration. We have heard a lot about displacement, and we've said that displacement is affecting a lot of people, and however there's no rehabilitative policy in terms of displacement. Now let us understand what migration is, and we've mentioned that migration could be of various types. So according to M.S. Rao, migration is a shift in the place of residence for some length of time. While it excludes short visits and tours, it includes different types of both voluntary and involuntary movements. Examples of involuntary movements are migration under such crises as war, transfer of population, riots, floods, droughts, and earthquakes. It also includes marriage, migration, very local, and transfer migration, among many others. Now, there are also other situations of migration where movement is part of people's earning a livelihood. There are nomads, shifting cultivators, itinerant traders, and salesmen, artisans, and laborers, among others. So we have two types of migration, which could be forced one, or which could be push factor or pull factor. So there are different concepts of migration, and we are going to look into more detail about the different types of migration. Now, we also know that a large number of tribals in India are also migrating from one place to another. This is primarily for education, for employment purpose, increasing standard of living or better standard of lifestyle. So these are the various factors, and also because of marriage. So these are the various examples or the various reasons as to why tribals migrate. Now let us look into more aspect of the migration. Now, transhuman is a special type of migration between two sets of settlement in different seasons. Now, M.S. Rao observes that there are two aspects of migration. First, what happens to the migrants in the place of destination, how they adjust themselves, and the kind of social consequence that follow. Second, what are the feedback effects of migration in the place of origin of the migrants. Now, the continuing interaction process between the place of origin and place of destination is an essential aspect of migration study. In the view of Rao, a cultural interpretation is important in gaining deeper understanding of the process of migration. So let us understand migration. Now, migration is considered to be a function of labor reallocation in response to market demands so that the demand and supply of labor are always in equilibrium. This is in terms of employment opportunities. Now, migration is also considered as an investment in human capital involving cost benefit analysis at different levels. At the individual level, it is argued that migration is based on careful calculation involving money and non-money, which is a psychological cost. While some economists do consider the importance of non-economic factors in explaining migration, others assume that the individual is a rational economic man interested in maximization of profit or utility. So that is what we talk about when we say migration of the tribals. Now they are migrating for a better quality of life, and it is only the poor who are attracted by a higher income or a better standard of living or better quality of living or better standard of education. So these are the reasons as to why most of the tribal migrates. Now if you look at the limitation of this theory, it does not explain why among people placed in the same economic circumstances some migrate and others do not. Now, secondly, it does not explain why people who are economically sound also moves to other cities. So, economic consideration does not wholly explain why people migrate. So, people might have different reasons as to why they migrate. Now, they provide only the necessary conditions for people to migrate. The sufficient conditions are provided by non-economic factors, which explains how migration occurs. Now, let us look at the patterns of migration. We've been talking about migration. Now, there are three patterns of migration. Involuntary migration, which is under crisis, such as wars, transfer of population, riots, as we mentioned. It could be because of marriage also, involuntary migration. Voluntary migration is move out in search of livelihood, better standard of living, employment, education for artisans, laborers, for better quality of life. And transhumance migration is a special type of migration between two sets of settlement in different season. Now, let us look, that is the pattern of migration that we looked at. And now let us look at the time-based migration. So what is time-based migration? Depending on the time, different kinds of migration. We have permanent migration. Permanent migration is when a person or a community or a group or a family moves from one place, that is place of birth, for a lifetime to another place. Now, the second is temporary migration. It is migrants who remain out of their home for few months in a year would be coming under the temporary migration people. And return migration or relay migration, there are different members of the same family who migrate in turn outside the place of residence to earn some money for the family. So this is, if you look at the world map, this is very common among the Mexican families, the peasant family. Now, seasonal or circular migration is a short-term stay, which is maybe a year or less, and outside the place of residence for mostly for livelihood, and it keeps on happening at a certain season. So it is seasonal migration. So for example, let's say in India we have a lot of let's say during the summertime or before Diwali, during festivals, we have a lot of laborers, skilled laborers who are coming from different parts of India for a skilled job or unskilled job, and once the season is over, they go back to their place of residence. So we have the seasonal migration. This is an example of seasonal migration. Now let us look at migration from tribal areas. Now, what is migration from tribal areas? In the light of the above various categories of migration, the migration of tribals from the central and eastern India has been divided into three categories. Number one, seasonal migration, which is as we mentioned about, and yearly or permanent migration to large cities for various purposes, and relay migration, that is family members going out in turn. So there's a relay of family members. Now, the migration of tribals from their regions or place of origin is not voluntary in India. In fact, they are forced out due to ecological degradation, landlessness and land alienation, unemployment and poverty. However, the propelling factor in such migration is to ensure survival for himself, herself and the family. So, when we talk about migration, we can understand the fact that not all migration is voluntary in nature. Some of them for better standard of life, which is voluntary. Some of them for employment may be voluntary, but some out of crisis, because of wars, because of riots. Now, if you look at the recent news that is happening, most of the tribal people are migrating from their hometown because of certain uprising, because of certain ethnic cleansing, because of certain political problems, the violence that is happening between the tribal people and the mainland people. So all these circumstantial experiences initiates or force the people to migrate from one place to another, and as mentioned, they are not voluntary. Now, going ahead further, let us understand what are the causes and consequences of migration. Now, Everett S. Lee has emphasized the role of pull factors or incentives associated with the destination areas. Push factors are those associated with the areas of origin, intervening obstacles such as ethnic barriers, distance, cost, and the personal factors to explain the migration of people from one area to another. Now, the pull factor includes employment opportunity in the cities, and the push factors include labor surplus with low productivity in the rural areas, disguised unemployment, and the exploitative relationship that exists in the villages. So, this theory has been utilized to explain the rural-urban migration in India. Now, it has been criticized, however, for oversimplification of the migration analysis, as push factor can also operate in the urban areas. So, for example, a migrant looks at both, so the positive and negative factor at the place of origin as well as the place of destination before they finally decide to migrate. So, migration happens after a long discussion within the families, or after understanding what is the purpose of migration and how would it benefit the person. So that is what it is considered. Harris and Tadaro considered migration to be a function of labor allocation in response to the market demands, so that the demand and supply of labor are always in equilibrium. Now, according to this theory, labor mobility occurs in direct response to the expected wage differential between rural and urban areas. As I've mentioned a while ago, that the poor people or the people who are looking for employment will always get attracted with the high wages or high salary, and that is what the wage difference is all about. The theory further elaborates that if wage differential between the rural and urban sector is in excess of equilibrium, the intersectoral transfer will continue until there is equality. Now, let us look at the consequences of migration. The consequence of migration is no less important. The consequence of migration may be analyzed in the framework of changes at the place of destination and changes at the place of origin. The impact of migration on the people at the place of destination can be analyzed in the following dimension, namely wage discrimination and exploitation, sexual harassment, vulnerable migrant child, girls in particular, and destruction of culture, kin networks, and social relation. So these are some of the consequences that a person who is a migrant have to undergo through. Mainly we hear a lot of domestic workers, or we hear a lot of migrant population being sexually abused, or being sexually, a lot of unfair things being done to them, because mainly most of them are women. Now, if you look at the tribal population, a large number of the tribal women and girls who migrate to the metropolitan cities like Delhi, Bangalore, Mumbai, Hyderabad for job purposes, most of them are women, and we hear a lot of cases about undue advantage being taken of them, or a lot of sexual harassment cases. Also, once when a person migrates, he or she is cut off from the tradition, the culture of the family, and then there's a loss of contact. There's a lot of connect that is missing. The gap exists. So these are some of the consequences that a person who is a migrant, who migrates voluntarily or because of the pull factor or the push factor, has to undergo through. So not all migration is pleasant in nature, but definitely people who migrate tend to succumb to the situation migration and understand the consequences and continue to do that, because they do migrate because of various reasons, and most of which is to increase or to have a better standard of life. Now, looking back at the slide, Kroll in 1986, while analyzing the migration of rural women to the urban centers in China, has argued that domestic workers are necessary as it released the urban women from the domestic responsibility to gain access to paid employment outside the home. Furthermore, domestic workers are required in China to allow other women to increase their contribution. So this is an example of China where women are needed, and so just like the tribal women or the tribal people or other population who migrates, their migration causes comfort to the other person. Excuse me. Now, a study by Nita Lodhaus shows that tribal women who migrate to the urban centers for employment in the lean season face several problems, and tribal women who are working on construction sites also face a lot of problems. Excuse me. So we see that when you talk about migration, especially among the women, maybe they may be tribal or non-tribal, there a lot of discrimination happens, and they are willing to face the consequences, and also the consequences have been faced because they look for a better quality of life, and some of them do not know, because when you look at the rural areas, when people come to the urban settings, most of them are generally not aware about the kind of life that they have to face, the kind of problems they have to face. So we saw a few examples where not only in India but in China also they need help, so that the other part of the women can go and have a comfortable life. And similarly in India we see that a lot of construction workers, the domestic workers who are working as skilled laborers, they are also working as the migrant workers. They are also needed in the society, because a lot of women or a family, they are also working, and they, in order to have a better standard of life, they come to the forefront. And so that is a correlation between the migrants and the people for whom they work. So that is an understanding. However, the unfortunate issue is that most of the migrant workers, especially women, they are facing a lot of discriminations and problems. Now, the illiteracy of the tribal women, along with the lack of technical knowledge, also leads to a lot of problem, and they also face a lot of socio-psychological insecurity, because they are unaware of the place, the new place, a new beginning, a new environment. So it leads to a lot of problem, and the impact of migration on the people at the place of origin can be analyzed on the following dimension. That is, effect on male migration is it leads to an improvement in the socioeconomic condition, and effect of female migration is it leads to improvement in the socioeconomic condition and position of the women. Now, we have a lot of other things to discuss, but however, in conclusion, let me inform that the session has attempted to highlight the characteristics, features of displacement and migration and their interrelationship. Now, these are sociological phenomena, and some of them are voluntary and other involuntary in terms of migration. We have also highlighted certain lacunas of the government policies regarding the rehabilitation and resettlements, as well as the inner contradictions. And we have also informed that displacement is one of the many factors responsible for forced migration. There are many patterns of migration, we've talked about it, and they have been dealt with briefly in this session. And apart from the causes of migration, the consequences of migration have also been analyzed in these sessions, and we have mentioned that the consequences have been social, cultural, economic, socio-psychological implication has been there in terms of the migration. So these are the few of the pointers that I have brought in the session in terms of displacement and migration of the tribals, and I do hope that you had got an understanding of what the session is all about. Thank you for your patient hearing.